Okay, I think we will get started now, and if more people join us, then they'll be able to catch up. Um, Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Dr. Jordan Golan, President and CEO of Jewish Family Community Services here in Pittsburgh, and it is my distinct honor to introduce our teacher for this morning, Rabbi Dr. Joseph Ozarowski, who is Rabbinic Counselor and Chaplain for JCFS Chicago. He is also an adjunct professor at the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership, as well as the Academy for Jewish Religion in Los Angeles. He was cited by Chicago Jewish News as Top Jewish Chicagoan of 2013. He received the Rabbi Mordechai Simon Award from the Chicago Board of Rabbis in 2014, served as President of the Board of Rabbis from 2015 to 2017. He now serves as President of Neshama, the Association of Jewish Chaplains, the NAJC. He's an engaging, nationally known teacher and speaker. He served congregations in Pennsylvania, in California, in Minnesota, in the New York area. If that weren't enough, he's also a prolific author. He co-authored Common Ground. He's written numerous articles. His first book, To Walk in God's Ways, Jewish Pastoral Perspectives on Illness and Bereavement, is considered a standard in the field of Judaism and pastoral care. I could go on. There's lots of wonderful things to say about Rabbi Ozarowski, but the one thing I do want to add is that Rabbi Ozarowski has the sort of the personal connection that I feel with Rabbi is the fact that he came to our community to help us after the synagogue shooting in 2018, and was part of the efforts to help our community to recover from that horrible event. And he will always hold a special place in my heart for that work that he did. So thank you, Rabbi Ozarowski, for what you've done in the past and for what you're going to do with us here this morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Golan. We're colleagues. We both work for Jewish Family Service agencies, and we have that in common as well. And I appreciate the very generous introduction. It's one of those introductions where you think, oh, I can't wait to hear what I have to say about myself. So I appreciate that. The title I chose for today is Trauma from the Past, Hope from the Future. That's an interesting topic, and I'll tell you where I got it from in just a moment. But I'm going to frame the conference, the session, and I'm going to frame the framing as well. Let me tell you the frame for the framing. I want to give you some definitions first. It's interesting, in Hebrew, there is no Hebrew word for trauma. Really, they had to invent the word. The Hebrew word is trauma. It's the same word. For resilience, there is a Hebrew word. The word is hitchosnut, which is actually the same word that is used in Hebrew for vaccination. We learned that during the pandemic COVID period. And so I think there's a relationship that resilience involves helping us get through the period. Some definitions, the definition of trauma, and I just walked this one. The American Psychological Association defines trauma as, quote, an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. None of those fit what we are commemorating today. They were not accidents. Maybe rape is something that we're using as a model and feel that the community felt that. It was certainly not a natural disaster. It's a human disaster. But I'll finish the definition. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Again, you'll decide whether that definition fits, but that's the American Psychological Association definition of trauma. Their definition of resilience is maybe more to point here. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of threats. And that, I think, is very significant, not just for what we are commemorating today and remembering today on literally the 5th anniversary, but also the fact that the issues out there are still continuing, that we are, I'm not going to be making this about the situation in Israel today, but I can't help but reference to it that we're still in a situation where Jews are feeling unsafe living or praying or working in a Jewish space. And I think there's a connection there. There is one other quote I'm going to share with you before I get into the framework for the second framework, which is from Dr. Morton Travis, who called me today a number of years ago. Resilience is an ongoing process of responding to adversity with concerted action. That's part of the framework here. I continue. It is not focused on a specific goal, but a way to help the impacted individual move forward. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is some lessons from Jewish practices, sources on practice in bereavement that can serve as a model. And the model is the key thing. Whether you did these things or not, whether you do these things or not is not important. It's what we can learn from some of the classic Jewish sources on bereavement that can help us move from trauma in the past to hope in the future. Now, I'm going to start it with the Dvar Torah. The Dvar Torah is from this week's Torah portion, and it's on a very arcane topic, but you'll see where I got the topic from. This week's Torah portion is Lech Lecha. It'll be read in synagogues all over the world tomorrow. And it's the story of Abraham and Sarah and their journeys, but tucked in is a very obscure little passage. It's about a little war, and the war involved hostage taking. And so there are some connections there. Abraham and Sarah find themselves in the middle of this war. Their nephew Lot is taken hostage, and they go to rescue him and fight in this war. But that's not what the Dvar Torah is about. The Dvar Torah starts this way. It's in Genesis chapter 14, verse 1, and that's what's in front of you right now. And it came to pass with these 4 kings, and in verse 2, they made war with 5 kings. My Dvar Torah is about the first word. It's not about the war. Vayehi, and it came to pass. And I want to study a little bit of Midrash with you, okay? This is from the introduction to the Midrash Esther Rabbah. And the connection to Esther is that it also starts out with the word Vayehi, and it came to pass. And I'm going to study this Midrash quickly with you. There's a lot to cover in the next 40 minutes or so. Rabbi Tanchum, Rabbi Rachi, Rabbi Chia, Rabbah, B'Shem, Rabbi Eliezer, Patrim. These great rabbis interpreted the following passage about a Midrash that came up in the exile. Let's start at the end of this first line. Kol makom shene'amar Vayehi Eino ela tzara. Anytime the word Vayehi, and it came to pass, is mentioned, it refers to nothing but trouble. Ooh, simple word, came to pass. That means trouble. And it continues, and it continues, a number of rabbis continue, it only says, Kol makom shenemar Vayehi bimei, it only means Vayehi bimei, when it came to pass in the days of, which is how our passage began. And that's also how the Megillah, the book of Esther, begins too, and that's the connection. It means nothing but trouble. And the proof text is the one we just saw right here. Now I'm going to skip the rest, and I want to go to the last line here. Further down in the Midrash, Atar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman v'Avda Palgu. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman came and disagreed with some teachers that I didn't mention here because they're not relevant to us. And he finishes as follows. Kol makom shenemar Vayehi. Anytime it says Vayehi, and it came to pass, and it was, it refers to trouble. Anytime it says that it will be, simchat refers to joy. Now, I need to do a little bit of Hebrew grammar teaching here. I don't know how familiar most of you are with Hebrew grammar. It doesn't really matter, but it's important to know this to understand the theme of this. The 2 words are actually flipped in Hebrew grammar. They're verbs. They're verbs. And they're flipped by something that we call the vav hahipuch, the Hebrew letter vav, which means and, which flips the tense from past and present to past. So yehi actually means it will be. Vayehi means and it came to pass and it was. Haya means it was. When you add the vav, v'haya, it means it will be. So the vav flips from past to future and future to past. And now you know where I got the title from. Trauma from the past, hope for the future. So I'm starting with this Dvar Torah. The question I'm going to try to posit today is, how do we get from there to here and forward? That's really my thesis for today. And I think that flipping from the past to the future may be the clue. We have to acknowledge the past, think about the past, remember it. I'm going to give you some concrete ways to do it, but also look towards the future. That's how we get from trauma to hope. I think human beings always have to hope. The question is, what are we hoping for? And that's an open question, which I probably will not answer in our session today, but I'll leave it to you as an open question for your Shabbat tables tonight, or wherever you're going this weekend. What might we be hoping for? Some obvious things comfort, maybe even hoping for hope, hoping for the ability to hope. That might be something worthy. The trauma, we acknowledge it. Many of us have lived through it, those of you in Pittsburgh, and I've met a number of you in the past. I was just there a few weeks ago, actually, a few months ago during the trial, and I got to meet a number of you in the courtroom, in the courthouse. So I was honored to be able to spend that time and share that with you, and some of you told your stories to me, and I wasn't the only one. But what we're going to do is go through some of the classic Jewish sources on bereavement to look for themes and models. Two more introductory points. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the great teacher of modern Orthodoxy, and I didn't include this as a text here, but I'm going to mention it because I think it's important for the framework. He taught that there were two types of bereavement, two types of mourning, and he termed them Avelut Yishana and Avilut Chadasha, old mourning and new mourning. That's what the Hebrew words mean. But he defined them a little bit differently. That new mourning is mourning that we express, that we experience when we've lost a loved one. You lose a parent, you lose a spouse, God forbid a child. I mean, anybody close friend, you grieve, you mourn. That's new mourning. It's individualized, and it's what we experience, and it's also expressed in Jewish tradition, which we're going to talk about. Old mourning, Soloveitchik defined as historic communal mourning, the type of grieving the Jewish people does as a community, the type of people any community does as a community, I guess. We wanted to extend it a little bit. And of course, he used a Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, where we mourn the destruction of the first and second temples thousands of years ago, as the classic example. But I don't think it is a stretch at all to speak about the 5-year anniversary that we are experiencing today as part of that. It's communal historic mourning. It is an unfortunate now and sad part of Jewish history, but part of how we get through it is by aligning ourselves within the history of our community. And that's part of my thesis for today, actually. What we're experiencing in Israel right now, it's too soon to even talk about it. In fact, I will just use it just as a background template, but today's session is not really about Israel. Let's talk about the stages of bereavement in Judaism. Let me make very clear that in the bereavement literature today, we don't really deal with stages. And whatever people are experiencing is certainly not linear, or to put it in other terms, we don't follow Kubler-Ross anymore. And maybe we never did. Kubler-Ross's research, and that's the 5 stages of bereavement, actually her research was based on anticipatory grief, people in hospice facing end-of-life care, and not about actual grief. And frankly, the 5 stages that she talks about, and I can't even name them all, and I'm not going to even try, people who grieve don't always experience all 5. And if they do, it's not necessarily in an order. And it's not important whether you do or whether you don't. So, but in Jewish tradition, there is a framework that we have, and the help of the framework is that it gives us a framework when framework has been ripped away from us. That's where the Jewish traditions become very, very helpful. And I'm going to use the stages of the behavior in Jewish tradition as a template for things that can help us beyond tradition, beyond any observance that we may or may not be doing. The first stage is known as Aninut, the initial stage of mourning. That's traditionally between the time of death and the time of the funeral. The Hebrew root word is Aleph Vav Nun. You can see it right here. I don't think I got it all. Aleph Vav Nun. If you look in the Hebrew, in a lexicon, in a Hebrew concordance is a biblical dictionary. And you don't have to be me to do this. You can do it. Anybody who, even if you don't know Hebrew, you can do this. You'll see where this root is found all over the Hebrew scriptures, all over the Tanakh, and basically you'll find most of the behaviors and even Kubler-Ross's stages in that one word. It refers to denial, it refers to a cry of bereavement, it refers to argument, it refers to a lot of different things. That word is found in a lot of places in that shorish, in that Hebrew root. It's interesting that one Hebrew 3-letter root can have all those different connotations, but it does. I don't have time to do this inside, but in my first book, I quoted Rabbi Soloveitchik in a different context, who talked about how this stage, where in Jewish tradition, We are not obligated to do positive commandments. When my father died 12 years ago, and I got in Thursday night into St. Louis from Chicago, and the funeral was on Sunday, so I observed this, which is basically you don't daven, you don't pray the regular prayers. I didn't put on tefillin, I didn't put on phylacteries, except on, I didn't say blessings, I didn't make a bracha. It's very odd if you're used to doing all these things on a regular basis to pull back from doing all this. But Soloveitchik's approach is that basically aninut represents the reaction to death. It's an outcry. Essentially, I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, we don't have time. But what Soloveitchik is basically saying is that life has lost to death. And as a result, we're not expected to praise God or affirm life in that stage. That's why we don't say blessings. I don't say a blessing over eating, which I normally would, and things like that. And halacha, Jewish law, allows us some space to be angry at God if we wish to be, or to be distant from God. Basically, God seems to be not present at that moment between the time of the death and the time of the funeral. As a template for something larger, those of you who live there can certainly tell me how long that feeling remained in the community. I know that when I came in several years ago, which was several weeks after the shooting, I still felt that in the people that I met with, the people that I counseled, et cetera, et cetera. Just using Israel as a template, I don't even think they've gotten to that stage yet. It's too soon. The funerals are still taking place, and there are other things going on. There's a war that's impending. So I don't think in Israel they've even gotten to the place where they can think about it in those terms. But here's where you see that the halacha gives an interesting template for us to look at our situation around us. Okay, let's continue. There are a number of practices that happen that surround the funeral itself. I'm not going to talk about the funeral at length, but there are three pieces that are worth talking about. One is called kriyah, the tearing of a garment. This is ancient and biblical. The idea of tearing a garment as a sign of grief and bereavement. And nowadays, a lot of people use a ribbon as a symbolic version of it. But if you do it with an actual garment, there's a real emotional tear. I mean, you put the emotions into it. I've seen it. I've done it actually myself. And there's a bracha, there's a blessing that's recited. I reproduce it here. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, dayan ha'emet. We acknowledge God as the true judge. By the true judge, what we're saying is that not, oh, we're so happy that God did what God did. We may not be happy at all. And that's not the point. The point is acknowledging God's ultimate power over life and death. The point is acknowledging that we don't have control over everything. And we need to say it. It's an attempt to accept the finality that has befallen us. So again, we're putting some themes together that can help develop our resilience, the ability to cry out and deny or argue, and the ability to acknowledge the fact that we're not in control and we are never going to be fully in control. I want to talk about the burial for a minute. What is the source of burial in Judaism? There's a mitzvah to bury, and it's a sacred ritual in Judaism. It goes back to Deuteronomy, and this is the verse from Deuteronomy. If somebody is, and it's the most extreme case in the Torah, where a person is convicted of a capital crime and is executed. Capital punishment as a whole, I don't want to even get into that. When I was in Pittsburgh in July, there was a whole question about what's the Jewish view on capital punishment, and there were differing views, and frankly, it was very traumatic for the people with whom I was with to even think about it, because that's what the trial was about. And what's the Jewish view, what's not the Jewish view? We're busy nursing our own wounds here, and it may or may not be important. Even the rabbis of the community had different views. So I'm not going to give you an opinion on that, because my opinion doesn't really matter, and I'm not sure I have one. But I want to give you the background behind it, that there is capital punishment in Judaism, and it's not used very, very often. And whether the conditions on which it was used would apply to the shootings at the Tree of Life building may or may not be true, and I'll leave that to others to talk about. But this is the source. If someone is executed, there's a mitzvah to bury them immediately the same day. So if you're going to do a burial, the mitzvah is to do it as soon as possible. And it's really interesting, because when I was doing hospital chaplaincy, so the hospital staff knew that if it was a Jew who died, they knew they could get the Jewish funeral directors quickly. Doesn't matter if they're religious, doesn't matter what their connection or affiliation was. But the Jewish funeral directors came right away based on this. A non-Jewish funeral director, well, will come in a day or two or three. It becomes a cultural thing removed from its religious context. But the question is then why? And here's where we learn some lessons. Here's the Talmud's spin on burial. Is burial because of bizyona, dishonor to the family if the corpse is not buried? Or is it kapara? Or is it atonement? What's the difference in Talmudic fashion? We're not going to do it all fully. We don't have time. But I want to give the base of it to you. If it's because of bizyona, then it may not depend on the survivor. In other words, it depends on who we're doing the burial for, the survivors or the deceased. That's the essence of the Talmud here. If the survivors don't want it, you still do it, you do. And if the deceased doesn't want it, I don't want kapara. Kapara means atonement or forgiveness. And the Talmud never answers the question. Which is it? Well, it may be a little bit of both. Okay? But again, the needs of the living and the needs of the deceased. Burial offers a sense of finality to it. Even while at the burial, we are still acknowledging the deceased. And again, we come to the third aspect of this, which is the liturgy. This is I didn't include the Hebrew here. This is the liturgy of the memorial prayer, which is used at the burial. It's also used at other marker moments, such as Yizkor, yard sites, when we dedicate the stone. And there's some important themes here. And then I'll pause if there are questions or comments. People want to, we have a couple minutes for that. God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, El Mali Rachamim Shachein Bamromim, find proper rest under the wings of your sheltering presence. So we're asking for rest, okay, and God's presence among the holy and pure. This is really important. Do we know that the person that we're saying this for was holy and pure? It may not matter. We acknowledge the intrinsic pureness of the human soul and the fact that they are out there, and we, regardless of what they did in this life, we want to give them the sense that they are with the other souls that are out there. Hushaina is the brightness of the heavens, the soul of, here we go, the Hebrew name. We always try to invoke the Hebrew name and connect them with their Jewish identity. But the last time I checked, what if you don't know the Hebrew name? And sometimes we don't. The last time I checked, God understood a lot of languages. And so he used whatever he got. Who has gone to their world and whose memory charity is offered. Keeping in mind that when we pray for the deceased, there has to be an action that's involved as well. It's the question of action. Charity is offered. The word charity is tzedakah, and tzedakah actually more properly is rendered as righteousness. So a righteous act, which could very well be charity, but it doesn't have to be, is you need an action. That's the key to understanding the passage. How do you gain peace for the soul? By doing something good in this world, which may be financial or it may be not financial. May his or her repose be in paradise, that they're at peace. We want to acknowledge that they're at peace. May the Master of Mercy bring her the cover of presence forever, and may their soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. I want to spend a moment on this question of the bonds of eternal life. It's a phrase that I heard a lot and I've used a lot as a former congregational rabbi, and now in my chaplaincy work, I must have used it, hundreds of times in my career, and I always wondered what it actually meant. It sounds nice, bonds of eternal life. But a number of years ago, when I was doing a study of the afterlife, and the best book for this, by the way, is Simcha Raphael's book, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. That's where I got it from. It's a masterful study of all sorts of Jewish views of the afterlife. And in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, there are 7 levels, the 7 journeys that the soul takes past this world. And the Tzor HaChaim is like level number 6. It's one of the highest levels out there, which changes the picture a little bit. We're asking that the soul, whatever the soul is doing out there, and again, we've never been there to come back and talk about it. They believe certain things, but I can't come back to, I was there. I can tell you it was like I wasn't there, okay? None of us were there. The closest we get to it are the near-death experiences, which talk about journeys and passages and light and meeting up lost relatives and things like that. But apparently the Tzor HaChaim, the bonds of eternal life, is one of the highest levels the soul can reach. And this is a hope and a prayer that the soul in its journey is elevated higher and higher and higher. May God be their possession. May their repose be peace. And let us all say, Amen. There we go. Okay, let me take a quick pause and ask if there are any questions, anything people would like to bring up at this point. You can either ask them, you can unmute yourself, or put them in the chat. No? Okay. If you'd like to ask, by all means, you can put questions in the chat. I am keeping an eye on the chat. So if you want to bring something up, either a question on what I'm teaching, or on the text, or something from your own experience, please feel free to do so. We do have a little time right now, and I sometimes I wonder if I'm going to be taking a lot of time, but we do have time to cover this in some depth. So please feel free. Okay. Next, the need to tell the story. I place this here because it applies both to the funeral service itself, but also what happens afterwards. During Shiva, we also tell stories. Telling stories. That is another way of how we get from there to here to forward. The word in Hebrew is hesped. Hesped linguistically in Hebrew is related to the Hebrew words for asaf, to gather together, and also to sweep up. We're kind of sweeping, gathering our stories and our memories together. So at the funeral, we talk about eulogies, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in the piece of Talmud we're going to study together. But also afterwards, at Shiva and beyond, it's really important and really healing to be able to tell the stories. How do we tell the stories? Where do we tell the stories? That's up to us. But I think it's really important to find a modality to tell the stories. The first reference to this is going to be coming up in the Torah reading in a couple of weeks. It's Chayesar, Genesis chapter 23. While people die in the Torah, and Adam died and Eve died, we don't know much about them, about their deaths. This is the first death that we know something about, and it's the classic source for a lot of what we do in Jewish bereavement. Batamot Sarah b'Kiryat Arba, hi Chevron b'Eretz Canaan, vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, that is Chevron. Chevron is in the West Bank. It's a very contested area. There are Jews there. There are a lot more Arab Palestinians there. But Sarah dies there. And Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to weep for her. Following this, Abraham buys land and buries her there, and he's eventually buried there himself. And their tombs are still there. You can visit there today. But I want to focus on the last part. Abraham comes to eulogize Sarah and to weep for her. Now, weeping, I think we all know what weeping is. You're crying. It's the emotion. It may or may not be tears. It's possible to weep without having tears. There's no one way to weep, but it's the emotion that accompanies what might be crying, the emotional part of it. And then there's a cognitive part, and that's the word eulogizing. And that's the word lispod, the word hesped, which is both Hebrew and Yiddish, is the Hebrew term for eulogizing. So what is eulogizing? I think most of us have a rough idea. If we've been to any funerals, we hear eulogies. But I'd like to suggest it may be more. It's the storytelling. And I'd like to study again a little bit of Talmud with this. I want to study inside. It's short, but I think we have the time to do it in a little bit of depth. Ibailu, this is the Talmud in Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin 46b. Ibailu, it was asked. Hespeda, eulogizing. Yakari dechaya or yakari deshchiva have? Is it honor to the living or honor to the dead? Who are we telling the stories for? Who are we eulogizing? And what is our purpose in telling the stories? Is it for the living or is it for the dead? We'll dive a little bit deeper in just a moment. Let's finish the Talmudic passage. The Talmud actually gives a classic passage. What would be the difference? Why does this matter? What would be the difference if it's the living or the dead? And it gives a classic Talmudic answer. Two answers, actually. What if the deceased said not to eulogize? In other words, if the person who died had in the will not to eulogize, generally speaking, we would follow that. But that would make a difference because the deceased didn't want it, and maybe the survivors did want it. Or there's a second answer. The Talmud always never satisfied with one answer. Or the difference would be in compelling the heirs where the survivors didn't want to pay the eulogizer. In the times of the Talmud, they had professional eulogizers, kind of what maybe some rabbis do today nowadays, where you're not a member of the synagogue and you need somebody to finish the funeral. The funeral director finds you a rabbi and you give the rabbi an honorarium. It's very common. So at the time of the Talmud, it wasn't necessarily a rabbinic function, but they had paid eulogizers. So what if the survivors didn't feel like paying the honorarium of the eulogizers? Would they still have to have it? And interestingly enough, the Talmud doesn't answer either question, nor does the Talmud answer the first question. So which is it? Is it for the living or for the dead? And the answer I'm going to give you, I mean, I did some, in my first book, I actually did a whole study of this, but the bottom line, I'll give you the bottom line of it, is that it's a bit of both. We want to say good things about the deceased. In Jewish belief, saying good things about the deceased, helps the soul elevate. There's a funny story I remember when I was first in a rabbinate. In the rabbinate many years ago, I've told the story where the rabbi did not know the deceased and tried to find out about the person. He couldn't come up with anything good about the person, nothing whatsoever. So the rabbi kind of flustered says, we have to say something good about Yankel, but I couldn't think of anything and I couldn't find anything. I did my research and I have to ask you, those who are present, does anybody here have anything good to say about Yankel? And there's silence. And then a voice comes up from the back, his brother was worse. So, but the point is, who are we saying it for the deceased, but also I would suggest it's also for the mourners, which means that a good rabbi doing a good funeral has to keep in mind and keep an eye out, has to look at the needs of the people present. What do they need? A good rabbi needs to listen. Anybody who is doing a eulogy needs to listen. So for the survivors, it is clear that Talmud gives space, that telling stories is healthy, is healing and helpful for the survivors. And so we need to tell the stories. Again, another piece of the puzzle of taking us from the trauma of the past to hope of the future is keeping those stories in mind. When I was in Pittsburgh, all three times, I was in Pittsburgh the first time, weeks after the funeral, you folks invited me back to teach during the year anniversary, and I came back for a day. I didn't teach this material. Actually, this is the one passage I did teach. I had a different context there. And then I came back in July, and I spent a lot of time listening to stories. That's what we chaplains do. We listen to stories. Keep telling the stories. People need to hear them. We need to hear them ourselves. We need to tell ourselves, tell our families, our friends. We need to keep those out there.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Please.
Is there any priority in Judaism about the needs of the living versus the needs of the deceased? Because it sounds like in a lot of what you're describing, both parties are important and both parties can be prioritized. But I'm wondering if there is any sense, do the needs of the living outweigh the needs of the dead, or is there any kind of comparison between the two?
Great question. And like in so many other things in Judaism, the answer is it depends. Depends on what the needs are. Quite often, the needs of the living do outweigh the needs of the dead. I mean, if you're a traditional Jew, then there's certain things that have to happen in terms of the burial process and the rituals that have to take place. But even within those, there's some leeway. I'll give you an example of cases that I've had, and maybe you've been involved. What if the survivors come from an abusive family? Let's say the person you're burying was abusive to their children. We work for Jewish family agencies, and we deal with these things all the time. So for me to say that Yankel was a tzaddik, he was a wonderful guy, and that wouldn't be appropriate. And worse than that, it might be actually quite harmful, mental health harmful to the survivors. So you have to find a sense of balance. You want to honor them in an appropriate way, but not at the expense of the physical or mental health of the survivors. So it's a delicate balance. there isn't always a black or white answer, do this or don't do that. It depends on the circumstances. It's a great question, and I think the answers would be ongoing depending on the circumstance. And I appreciate you asking that. Let's talk, and that's an important theme to keep in mind. Notice how the Talmud kind of balances it and doesn't fully even answer the question about needs. This is twice already where the Talmud hasn't answered which needs take precedence. I think the Talmud is leaving us to figure that out. So my answer is a non-answer, but I think it is the answer.
Rabbi, may I ask a question?
Please.
So I am sorry, I can't remember the name of the section. It was the first section of the grieving where you're speaking about where sometimes it leaves room where we could be angry at God after the event happens.
Yes, I knew it.
And I guess I didn't know that existed, but I also have felt that. And I wonder if, do people get stuck in that section for a period of time? And how have you dealt, if you have dealt personally with maybe helping people get through that stage?
A lovely question. And I can say that a large part of my chaplaincy work here at JCFS, my counseling load is on that topic, actually. When they're angry at God after a certain period of time, they often find themselves in my office and with me. So yeah, I spend a lot of time on that. I think that it depends really on how long this lasts. In the initial stages, I think it's perfect. It's not only permissible, Soloveitchik's teaching, it's helpful and important to do it. But if it's been a year, and we're going to get to that point actually in the next 10 minutes, I want to finish this up with enough time, but I want to answer your question, then I'll go to the other texts. If after a year or 5 years, you're still feeling angry at God or angry at the person who died or angry at other family members or feeling negative emotions, then that's when the grief has some pathology to it. Grief is not a pathological condition. Grief is not an illness. Grief is a state of life. But when it gets in the way of living life day to day after a year, let's say, after the year of mourning, then it probably needs some intervention, whether it's a therapist or a chaplain or some combination of the above or some other type of trusted person. And frankly, some of it is more chaplaincy oriented. It's not therapy so much as spiritual care that the person needs, especially if it's God who's in the picture. My own experience, by the way, is that God often takes the hit for anger at other people. We take it out on God, but it may not be about God at all. God may not be as relevant in the picture as we think. But that's where I think talking to someone else who has some training in the area can be very helpful. Great question. Tell you a little secret. Just as a follow-up, then I want to go to the rest of the text here. When I was sitting shiva for my father, I reread my book. And I reread this chapter about being angry at God, and it didn't speak to me. My own words did not speak to me. It's really interesting because I wasn't really angry at God. My dad was a Holocaust survivor who lived to the age of 96, and the first part of his life was horrible. The second half of life was actually quite lovely, and I had him for a long time. And I said my own words aren't resounding with me. They're not speaking to me, which taught me another important lesson. That writing and researching and teaching about grief is not the same thing as walking the path of the mourner. It's really not the same thing. I'm supposed to know a little bit about these things, but when I was a mourner myself, what I wrote was irrelevant to me. So another lesson I learned from that experience. So thank you for asking that.
Well, thank you.
Let's talk about Shiva a little bit. We know about Shiva. Shiva means 7. It refers to the 7-day mourning period after the funeral. Although many people now think of Shiva as a much smaller period, 3 days. People make their own choices, of course. In fact, some people think Shiva is the immediate meal after the funeral. I'll get to the meal in a moment, but I want to talk about the actual observance of it. This is the source for Shiva. We don't have enough time to do it in detail, but it's a very dramatic portion. Ezekiel was already among the exiles who had been forced out of Israel by the Babylonians prior to the destruction of the first temple 2,500 years ago. Now, they didn't know when the temple was destroyed. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have communication. So how would they know when the temple was destroyed in exile in Babylon? So God gives Ezekiel this prophecy saying, Son of man, verse 16 here, I take away from you the desire of your eyes with a stroke. The desire of the eyes is his wife. God is saying your wife is going to die. Stroke doesn't mean necessarily a stroke, a medical stroke, although it might have been. We don't know that. Basically, God is telling Ezekiel, your wife is going to die, but do not eulogize, do not weep, don't let your tears run down, don't emote. Your wife's death is going to be a teaching tool to let the people in exile around you in Babylon know the temple has been destroyed by your landlords, by the Babylonians. But the sources for Shiva here is sigh in silence, do not make mourning for the dead, do not bind your head glory upon you, which is understood to be put your tefillin on. People in Aninu do not wear tefillin. Put your shoes on your feet. One of the topics of one of the practices of Shiva is not wearing leather shoes. Cover not your upper lip. This refers to a practice we don't do anymore, which is encloaking the head, and eat not the bread of others. In other words, this is referring to the Shiva meal, which according to Jewish tradition is brought by others. I'll get to that in a little more detail in a minute. But clearly, the prophet is talking about practices that we recognize, some of them at least, that go back. They're not in the Torah, but they're definitely present during the first temple period over 2,500 years ago. And this is very dramatic. So I spoke to the people in the morning. In the evening, my wife died. In the morning, I did as command. Basically, God is saying, don't sit Shiva, because your death is going to be a teaching tool. So from the exception of Ezekiel the prophet, we learn the rule that we do observe these things, and clearly his people observe these things as well. So Shiva can be a lot of different things. It's time to be with family, friends, community, in any shape or form the mourners want. And again, going back to Jordan's question, in a case where a mourner says, I don't want visitors during Shiva, we follow them. We follow the needs of the mourner in this case. Is Shiva for the sake of the deceased? To some extent, yes, but more so, it's for the sake of the mourners. Here's a classic case where somebody says, I really can't deal with visitors at a Shiva house right now. I need to be alone. We respect that. We let the mourners decide, or I only want visitors from 10 to 12 and 1 to 4 and 8 to 10 in the evening, or whatever it is. People get to make those choices. The needs of the mourners in the case of Shiva do indeed take precedence over the respect to the deceased in that case. So it's a tool to help us get through the immediate period. It's also a template. So in other words, I'll let you decide when the community in Pittsburgh went into Shiva. It may not have been right away. It may have been sometime afterwards. It takes some time to process, but the stages as a template, I'm teaching them not so much as do this and don't do that, but more as a template for looking at our own experiences in bereavement. So that's Shiva. It's funny, in the era of COVID, Shiva took on a whole different role where we did Shivas by Zoom. Who ever heard of such a thing, doing a Shiva by video chat? But you know something? It was odd. It was weird. I actually went on a couple of them from my old congregation in Long Island. I'd been back in Chicago for some 20 years already, but I spent 13 years in Long Island with a wonderful congregation, and I had 2 Shiva visits. And after the weirdness of meeting my old congregants on screen ebbed away a little bit, I realized that a Zoom Shiva did what Shivas are supposed to do. We got to laugh, we got to cry, we got to tell the stories, we got to share with each other, we got to be with each other. And so a Zoom Shiva can be an honorable and healing and effective Shiva. So using technology in that context can be very, very helpful. I said I'd come back to this question of the meal. There's a mitzvah to have a meal after the Shiva. It's a meal that you're not supposed to do yourself if you're the mourner. Somebody else should do it. It could be catered, it could be a lot of things, but ideally it should be brought by friends or people close by. Again, it's community coming to help. Nowadays, we all don't live in communities so much anymore. We don't belong to synagogues. A lot of that goes on. So how do you recreate that? That's a challenge. I don't have an answer. It goes beyond our conversation today. But I think there's an argument there that we need some kind of connection. And the idea of having a meal also implies the lesson of self-care. How do we get from trauma to hope? Self-care is an important part of it. It's not just a luxury. Well, you got to take care of yourself. It's an essential part of it. So we have to leave space for others. We have to leave space for ourselves. I'm coming now to the final part of my presentation here, and we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to finish up. The Talmud Moed Katan has an interesting topic about the stages of Jewish bereavement beyond. What about after the funeral, after Shiva, after all that stuff? Two views. I'm just going to read them in English. Do not weep for the dead, quoting Jeremiah. Do not moan for him. What does this mean? This is the English. 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogizing and lamenting, and 30 for wearing freshly laundered clothing and haircuts. These are the classic stages that we have that are ensconced in Jewish law. The weeping, the immediate crying is the first couple days. 7 days, the 7 days, this is Shiva we were talking about before. And then 30 days is the Shloshim period that comes with the Shiva and afterwards, which is the classic mourning period for all relatives. We add to that up to a year for parents, but that's only for parents. Every other relative gets 30 days. And that we don't take haircuts and don't wear freshly laundered clothes. After that, the Holy One says, you cannot be more compassionate than I am. Don't be more merciful than I am. God says, after 30 days, get on with life. That's view number one. Personally, from my clinical perspective, I prefer view number two, and that's where the needs of the mourners take precedence. I prefer Rabbi Levi. What does Rabbi Levi say? A mourner during the first 3 days of Shiva should see himself as if a sword lies on him between his two thighs. Sword between your legs, like ugh. Like that's how grief feels. Piece has been ripped out of you. From the third to the seventh day, it's as if the sword faces you in a corner. The sword's kind of facing you, right in front of you, not between your legs, not in your gut anymore, but it's facing you. And afterwards, it's as if the sword moves along with you in the market. Let's talk about that for a minute. What does it mean for the sword to move along with you in the market? I think some of you may have figured this out already. I prefer Rabbi Levi's approach that after the immediate periods of mourning, the sword is symbolic of the loss or the threat given by the loss. I mean, it's threat, but it's loss. It never fully goes away. The question, it goes with you in the market. I think resilience and moving from trauma to hope means acknowledging that the loss is always there and it will always be with you, but you learn to live with it. Last text, okay? There's one other dimension here that I want to bring up, and then I'm going to summarize it, and we'll then go on to the following prayer that Carol is going to lead us in. This is, again, from the Talmud Katan. This is connection. Rabbi Meir says, if one eulogizes others, others eulogize for him. If one buries others, others will bury you. If one carries the casket, others will carry them. If one raises their voice in lament, others will raise their voice for him. What does this mean? There's a connection here. We talked about a vertical connection. We talk about a horizontal connection. That if you engage in acts of kindness at times of vulnerability for others, then when your time comes, and all of our times will come eventually, sooner or later, we all face death eventually. It's part of life. But others will then do it for us. So another reason is, and helping us to develop resilience and hope, is the fact that we're part of something larger than ourselves. And if we exercise our ability to offer kindness, chesed, to others, then others will then reach back to offer chesed and kindness to us. So, to summarize here, there are stages in the Jewish version, not in the emotional version, but in the Jewish version. And those stages, I think, can help us. We talked about being able to cry out, being able to ignore structure for a period, and then we bring structure back in, to acknowledge the finality, ritual, self-care, community, telling the stories, noting that the loss never fully goes away, but somehow we can still move on, and that we are part of something larger than ourselves. So here we are 5 years later, on October 27th, and we're still seeing anti-Semitism into the world, and yet I would posit, in spite of the fact that the world seems like a very crazy place, that there is still hope, there's still life, we still can be able to go on. And my blessing and my hope and my prayer is that we all find within ourselves, within each other, and within our tradition and our communities, the tools that will help us move forward. And I want to thank you for sharing this 45-minute period of learning Torah in memory of 11 holy people in Pittsburgh and all those who are around them.
Carol, are you ready to lead us in the prayer?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabah, v'yamad divrah hirusei v'yamlich melchusei, v'chayehon uv'yamechon uv'chayeh d'chol beis Yisrael, ba'agalo uv'zman karev v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei rabba mevorach li'olam omei omaya. Yisbarach v'yishtabach v'yispor v'yisramam v'yisnasei, v'yisadar v'yisaleh v'yisalal shemei dekudasha barihu. La'elo mimchol ber chosav ashirasa, tush b'chosav v'nechemasa, damiron b'yoma v'yamru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidehon, v'al kol Tamidehon, v'al kol mond oskin b'iraita, dihi v'dra hadain v'di b'chol atar v'atar, yehe lachon achon shloma rabba, hina v'histacho v'rachamein, v'chayin arichin, umazona ravicha, uperkuna mikadam avuam divi shemaya v'yamru amen. Yehe shlomo rabba min shemaya, v'chaim tovim olenu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen. Osei shalom bimramav, hu barachamav yasei shalom. Olenu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a meaningful day. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom.